Welcome everyone, it's nice to see you all. My name is Jeff. I think I know all of you, so I don't have to introduce myself. For what we have, little announcements. We appreciate you bearing with us with our technology. We've been jerry rigging different things every single day. Happy to announce that we have just received a grant for some high-end video equipment, and so we'll be purchasing that. And I don't know if it'll be ready for next time, but there's light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll get that going soon. So thanks for your patience. In addition, the only other announcement that I have is please be aware of our Idaho Falls Hammond Mini Maker Fair is coming up on Saturday, October 9th. This is something that we've done a couple of times before. It's a really fun event. It is included with your museum admission, and I know most, possibly all of you are museum members already anyhow. And essentially it's a fun sort of a show and tell opportunity. People who are makers, who build things, who create things, engineers, artists, whatever realm that cool projects that they've been creating. Out for makers, if any one of you would like to show something off, or you know someone who might enjoy that sort of opportunity, would be happy to have you there. And there are flyers in the back there that give a little bit more information about how to go about that. But I'm also happy to answer any questions. So that's that. I guess the one last little announcement is we are eking back into offering refreshments here at Museum Club. Thanks to Camille, we are starting out slow. We have water. We'll get back in enjoying the past as well, and that'll be a nice, hopefully, incentive to get you all to come back. As if Gregg Losinski isn't enough. So, with that note, I would like to introduce Gregg Losinski, who some of you probably know already. He's had a long and illustrious and multifaceted, and I suspect rewarding career, anchored by almost 35 years with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, where he served in several capacities, educating and communicating with the public on a variety of issues. Among his specialties, of course, is bears. He has worked on grizzly bear recovery and is an expert on human-bear conflicts, and has leveraged that expertise into some fun opportunities, including traveling around the world with the Fulbright Specialist Program and others to talk about bears in Slovakia, this guy is in demand. Since retiring from Fish and Game, he is currently an education and media specialist at Veolia. Although, is it still Veolia?
Yeah, until the 27th.
Okay, very good. And he's a frequent collaborator with our education department here at the museum, where he has, in all between opportunities here at the museum and elsewhere, he is all sorts of other good stuff, and we're honored to have him here to help us look today at bears from the inside out.
I guess this is for our folks online, so they can actually hear what's going on as well. I appreciate that, Jeff, and I as I look around, I do know a lot of folks here, so I'm glad to speak and hopefully. A lot of people recognize me from my fishing game days, and I was really fortunate back then because it was never my job description as far as doing anything with bears. It was something that I was allowed to put in there along the way and then get very involved with. And I know some of the people here have actually helped in various educational opportunities that we've had along the way, and especially recognize Ken here, who was leader of our bear education trailer. one is unique in that for this was the show that's going on currently in the museum. One of the disappointments was that they were going to have a bear be brought over as part of the show as well, but because of some of the lunacy, I'll say, of the Endangered Species Act and CITES, they couldn't import a plasticized bear, which again makes no sense. But so it would need to have it here. But in the meantime, I brought a few samples to do with how they're put together and how we're put together. And so, as Jeff mentioned, I'm being allowed to do this as my current employer is a company called ESER, and they're the folks that do all the environmental monitoring out at the site for the last 20 years. They do the air, water, plants, and animals. And as part of their contract, they've always had an environmental educator. And so I just picked this up after coming out of retirement to fill in for someone. And now our contract, well, the whole company has been bought away from Veolia, which is a French company, now by Patel. And so at the end of the month, we'll all be part of the board, I guess. I won't be able to make nice, fun slideshows like this because I'll have to get everything approved by DC. And this is the last hurrah in that respect. And as part of that, this is my traditional disclaimer that I always put in that the opinions here are mine and no one else's, because a lot of, especially when you start getting into animals out there can get game work that I don't miss the politics. So when I speak here, I speak as myself, and I'm not representing anyone else with my opinions. And of course, I use a bear for my message because this is one of the best communicators that we've had. I mean, he actually drives me nuts on the radio because every time you turn on 590, they use the Smokey Bear ads as what they call a brick in the radio business. It's an automatic filler, so they can't. Whenever you hear those Smokey the Bear PSAs, it's because they couldn't sell a commercial to anybody else. And message just smoking talk is a whole other presentation. Another thing that I do want to point out is that I'm a horrible thief when it comes to images. And if this was a scientific presentation, I would get in trouble because I don't document all my sources. So again, I do this just for educational value and not to make any money off of it. As Jeff mentioned, most of my time was spent at Idaho fishing game, and along the way, I was able to branch out courtesy of the interagency Grizzly Bear of grizzly bears in the lower 48 states. Big part of that, of course, was scientific, but there's also the political and the human side, which I was working with mainly. And as part of that, we, of course, were part of the Yellowstone ecosystem and did recovery work there as well as education. And then along the way, we have a program that's doing incredibly well. We'll kind of talk a little bit about it. And that's the Certified Bear Resistant Container Program. So if you go to Walmart today or even Fred Meyer or First Sporting Goods stores, you're going to find coolers that have been tested as part of the program. We'll talk about a little bit of that later on. And then I've been fortunate human bear conflicts there and help educate. So very, I think, like I say, for something that wasn't in my job description, I got a lot of mileage out of it and a lot of satisfaction. So as we go through this presentation, know that my experience comes from all different facets of working with bears, whether it was biological with the monitoring and the counting of the bears, as well as education efforts, doing things like this today. I was also fortunate to be enforcement and be able to do habitat. Video on wild bears, even captive bears, and talk a little bit about that as we go. So my goal, and I apologize to some of you that have seen my parts of my presentation because I cannibalized them to of course make this, is to make you smarter than the average bear. And the funny part is that when I use this now, kids have no idea who this is. Everybody here probably does, but the kids, they're like, I don't know that bear. It's wow, okay, so we need to get kids brought up to speed on our cartoon bears as well. But when it comes to bears, like I say, they're intelligent animals, and my talk really is just about what we're learning for bears and how they function. And one thing I do like to say is I've studied bears up close, as well as the big picture of where they live and how they interact. This bear here, which is in a lot of pieces, which Ken is familiar with, is hopefully going to be coming here to the museum soon for its new home. This bear was a poached grizzly that I was able to cut the meat off. At the beginning there, you saw a claw that had the bones of a front paw, and what we had that bear cleaned off with beetles and chemical solutions, so that now it is like plastic. Kind of re-articulate that and can challenge, and hopefully, like I said, the folks at the zoo or me here at the museum will pick it up and keep going with it. So it is kind of it's not a work in progress. So when we start talking about bears, who here had a teddy bear when they were a kid? Everybody, probably. Okay, so we bond with bears at a very, very young age, and part of that is the way they're built. We can relate to them. I'll talk about that as we go. Of course, we all heard stories when we were little too, right? Goldilocks and Three Bears. Maybe later on, kids read books about the Berenstain Bears. And of course, like I mentioned, we had good old Smokey Bear. And when it comes to bears, one thing I want to start with, as far as talking about bears from the inside out, is saying that everything that you learned about bear families was wrong. Okay, bears are very dysfunctional when it comes to being a family, and it's all about when you're an animal, it's all about survival. And for bears, they have a lot of different and so the first thing is, okay, if you ever see some bears together, it's because it's a female with her young, and rarely are you going to see a male involved in that, unless it's in the spring. And in spring, in May and June, you're going to see females mating with multiple males, so they are promiscuous in that respect. But there's even a reason for that, even, and that is that when you're a male bear, your whole thing is about passing on your bloodline. And male bears, unlike other animals, can't really tell by sniffing the young that it's one of theirs or not. But they do, studies have shown, remember if they hooked up with that female or not. Now, where it gets interesting is that a female will mate with multiple males, and then after just a few cell divisions, that blastocyst, which is called, will just kind of float around inside of her, and it's not alone. It's actually, her body's juggling all these little blastocysts from all these different bears later on, those various blastocysts to implant and develop. And the rate of development is incredible. It starts in maybe November, and by January, February, the cubs are born. So they go from basically nothing to full-blown cubs within a few months. So that's a pretty incredible adaptation that they have. The other thing that's interesting is that, so when the implantation occurs, is that they could be from multiple males. So if a female had a litter, it could, say, up to 4 cubs, there could be 4 different fathers there. So when the male comes along, he sees this female, he kind of remembers, he probably is not going to try to kill the cubs, because if he didn't recognize her, or if he just thought, well, maybe I want to have another go at it, if he kills the cubs, the female will go into heat within 48 hours. So that's his incentive. It's part of the reason. So, like I say, that's why you're not going to often see a female or a mama bear, papa bear, baby bear situation. Lay out there. The other thing about bears is that we kind of relate to them is because they're built like we are. These are some grizzly bear's back paw, and there's his front paw. And if you take a look at those, they look a lot like our feet and hands. And especially if you pull off, over here I've got some hides, you'll notice that when they pull the hides off, especially if they're doing it for mounting purposes, they're going to take the claws with it. So when you take off the hide of a bear, and in Idaho and other states, when you harvest a black bear, at least, you need to bring the skull in. So when you take the skull off of a bear and the hide off, the carcass that's left behind looks a lot like a person. And because of that, sometimes Fish and Game, we actually did used to get calls from the sheriff's department saying, we have a report of a headless body in the woods. Could you guys come check it out for us? And every time it was a headless bear. It was never a human that had been decapitated. The one that we relate to is that they're walking flat, whereas a deer has the modified toes, so it's walking on its digitigrade. It walks on its digits. Well, bears are plantigrade, so they can do things like stand up. You'll see videos on YouTube about bears that have burnt paws and they're walking around, or nowadays, of course, PETA wouldn't allow us to have bears in a circus that are boxing or riding bikes or doing things. But bears can do all those things like we can because we're basically built the same. And actually, they're built. A lot. The one human skeleton is that if you're looking at the skeleton of a male bear, it does have one more bone than a female bear. Okay, so bears have a thing called a vacuole, a penis bone that humans, of course, don't have. And the bear that you saw me taking apart there originally was a male bear, but thanks to my dog, it now is a female. But anyway, so we relate to bears. A lot of cultures use the bear as part of their creation kind of mythology. And it's because the bear is so alike a person, and we'll talk a little bit maybe more about that towards the end. But anyway, so we relate to bears, and I'm going to do a quick overview on the bears we have in the world. And the cool thing is that one of the bears that we have here in North America, our Ursus arctos, is actually found. It's a circumpolar, found in every continent in the northern hemisphere. And then we do have our black bear, which is found in North America, which is different than the other black bear species elsewhere on the planet. And then lastly, as of today, or yesterday, maybe just given the timeline, China has ruled that the panda is no longer an endangered species. It's moved up a notch, become threatened. But that's kind of false because it's based on animals that are in zoos. So captive reproduction has gone really well. There's only been 14 pandas released. But right now, because of habitat loss and things, it's going to be a challenge. But that's kind of a big thing for bears that as of now, it's moved up a notch on the scale as far as the panda. And so here's just again looking at that distribution, and that's why it was interesting that I could work with grizzly bears here in Idaho, which are the same bears that we have all, of course, in Canada and Alaska, which are the same bears that we have all the way across Europe. I mean, there's places in Europe, like Italy, that have 2 or 3 bears left. And then we can also have the same bear in the desert bears. So it's like I say, it's we'll talk a little about bears, breakdowns from there. The thing about size is that there's a thing called Bergman's rule that the colder an area is, it pays to be because of surface area, a larger animal. And if you look at our bear continuum here, you'll see that the larger bear, the polar bear, lives in a very cold place, while the smallest bear, the sun bear, lives in a very warm place. So a great example of that Bergman's rule in action is with bears, and as far as their sizes. The other thing about bears and sizes, you can see the chart here, is that when you look at the bears of Idaho, which we'll talk about in a sec, the brown bear. Our black bears here in Idaho are tiny compared to, say, a black bear in Pennsylvania. And that's all has to do with the availability of food. And then we'll talk about hibernation also down the line. So again, just know that there's a big continuum in the size of bears, and a lot of it is based on the temperature of where they're mostly found. So when I'm talking about bears, you see some naming conventions. And I thought that pigs and bears split off somehow, and so the naming convention continues with females being a sow. So the same big names for pig and swine as you have for bears. Of course, we call a bear young a cub, and then I might talk about a sow with yearlings, And with bears, like grizzly bears, could be 2 or 3 years that she'll have those cubs with her. And even though they're multiple years, we still call them yearlings. And it gets to the point where you can't even tell the difference between mom and her cubs because they've grown so large. And that's when she's going to kick them out when they're about her, starting to catch up to her in size. Also, if we have a lot of bears together, we call it a sloth of bears. And there are sloth bears. We have sloth bears here at the zoo here in Idaho Falls. But the proper term for a bunch of bears are a sloth of bears. One thing about this picture that's really unusual is that there's a lot of bears in the picture. Okay, bears generally don't like to hang around other bears. The one exception is there's a lot of food. So just like when you go to Chuckarama or Golden Corral, everybody's happy as long as there's a lot of food. If there's not a lot of food, things get pretty ugly. And this is where I always put a plug in for a book or a movie called Grizzly Man. If you've never read it or seen it, it's about Timothy Treadwell, a person who did everything wrong for a dozen years around bears, but got away with it because the bears had plenty of salmon. The 13th year when he went back with his girlfriend, there was not a lot of salmon, and he and his girlfriend both ended up being killed and consumed by the bear. And again, that's fairly rare to have a person eaten by a bear, but in this case, he definitely pushed his luck. So again, if you want to see it, especially the movie Grizzly Man, it's wild that he actually filmed a lot of the footage in the movie of himself. That was available and survived. Right here in Idaho Falls, but if we go to the other side of Yellowstone by Cody, up in the high talus slopes, I'll talk a little bit about foods a little bit later on. And it's the one place where we can, when we fly new bear counts, we can count 200 brown bears in a day because they're all on the big talus slopes at about 11,000 feet or so feeding. I'll talk about what they're feeding on a little bit here, but that's again the time when they're tolerant. This is up in Alaska, and there's a bear viewing platform right here. And again, they can do that because the bears don't care about the people because there's plenty of salmon. But when the salmon runs shut down, then they don't let people stand there that close to bears anymore. For Idaho, or North America, we've got 3 bears here, 2 of which are found in Idaho. I always want to point out this guy here in a sec, but I'll talk about first the natives, the black bear, the grizzly or brown bear. Of course, North America does have the polar bear. We are reading more in the news. The polar bear with brown bears are interbreeding, which is something they're able to do, and the offspring is something called a pizzly or a growler. And what's interesting is that this stuffed version, which is the only one that I know of in the lower 48, is actually in Idaho, over in the guy's living room over by Boise, because he had a permit to go hunt. He's up in Alaska. This thing just does that. It was able to get around that CITES law, the same law that wouldn't let that brown bear come here from Germany to be part of the show. Also prohibits right now polar bears from being even legally harvested in Canada and Alaska, brought into the US. So because it was a hybrid and there's no rule about that, you go see the only Pizzly bear in the lower 48 if the guy would let you in his living room over there. And, so we're going to talk about our bears here in Idaho. First, I'll talk a little about some of the captives, ones you can see real close. And this one is kind of near and dear to my heart. This is a bear named Shoney, which is in probably one I consider to be the best zoo enclosure. Pocatello Zoo, Ross Park Zoo. It's a very natural place, and it's a place that luckily they just built, and they had an older bear there. One more bear, you see, kind of got scraped up in there because the other bear wasn't exactly thrilled about him being there. But anyway, most bears, when they're getting into trouble, they have to put down. You can't move a bear; they just get back into trouble again. In this case, they're able to get the zoo there approved, even though the zoo Idaho is not what we call an AZA facility yet. It doesn't meet all the standards of the American Zoological Zoo and Aquarium Association. But none of that really has to do with the animals there. It has to do There's things on the lava. Right now, I'm updating their black bear facilities as well, because they are not ancient, but they are part of more towards the medieval end of kind of bar and cages and things. But they are working hard to move away from that. So if you want to see our native species of bears in a zoo, you can go to Zoo Idaho just down the road. If you go to our zoo here, the formerly Tophus Park Zoo, you can see the sloth bears, and they are of course not a native, but they're neat to go see, and they've been heading as far as the capture, just like with the pandas. So that's a neat thing that's going on here. Here at Museum Idaho, of course, they have no live bears, but I do get to teach here and use the examples of the bears out here when we teach with kids. So I like to put a plug into the museum as far as their bears. And then I'm going to mention down the road a place that is not a zoo, it's not ACA approved. It's a place where you definitely can see the bears of Yellowstone's past begging for food and scraps, and you can get more than 30. It's always important that you go see these, or they're illegally shipped out of the state. And there's ongoing investigations right now that are finally starting to come to light, but there's a lot of politics and money involved in this. But anyway, so again, it's a place where you can see how Yellowstone used to be with bears eating garbage and begging the cars and such, but in reality, it's not a good thing. What a good thing, you go up to the Grizzly Wolf Discovery Center, which is an AZA facility. They are expanded now for black bears as well as some the grizzly bear enclosures, which we'll talk about in a sec. This is where they do our certified bear container testing, and that's really, I think, a neat thing that goes on there. Hibernation, we'll talk about the difference between the two facilities as well and what bears do. So this is a little bit of an example if you've never seen there. What goes on at the Grizzly Wolf Discovery Center. This is up in, like, say, Driggs or Teton Valley. You need to have a bear resistant container that's approved to put garbage out in. If you don't, then you can't put it out till the garbage man comes, and that's so you don't addict the bears to eating garbage. And in this case, this huge Kodiak, and he's CPR pump trying to test it in there. These containers are all full of rotten fish covered in blood and jam, and it's what's going on in that container because it's thrown into such a and my work with them, I was fortunate to I mentioned a little bit of Slovakia, and this was a communist trash container that we had brought over and full of all kinds of stuff. And this is the container that is still being used in most of the former Soviet countries. And in this case, we've got it loaded up with all kinds of stuff, and this bear will have no trouble in a second. Here is holding on, but we, like I say, we use the facilities there as well as some companies to work to try to stop this problem. My talk today, now as I start to get into how bears think and work, is dedicated to George Stevenson. I think you probably met him, Ken, didn't you? He was a retired brain surgeon who had access to grizzly bears via the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, and he did all kinds of neat research and then education with bear brains. He had boxes of bear brains that he would drag around and pull out and let people poke at them and see how they were put together. And so I have a copy of this little book there over on the side there if somebody want to look at it a little bit later. It's just, like I say, neat to see. So we're going to talk again in this program about our local bears here, brown bear or grizzly bear, and of course the black bear. Even though brown bear is the proper name, when it comes to the bears over there, you can see a couple of different bear hides, and both the big large ones are black bears. So black bears do come in all shades of colors. I'll show you here in a second a little different one. One thing that's kind of fun when we start talking about the names of the bears is that in Idaho we give our bear a special name. Ursus arctos is the proper scientific name for brown bear worldwide. But around here, if you go to, say, Yellowstone or Grand Teton parks, or even maybe in this, I checked here what the sign may say, you're gonna see another name tacked on there, and that's Horribilis, Ursus Arctus Horribilis. And that's all because of Lewis and Clark. They had such a horrible time with the grizzly bears as they came west, that when they were doing the naming of the bear, back at the precursor to the Smithsonian, they slapped that name on it and it still sticks. But again, it has nothing to do with the biology of the bear, only has to do with more or less the historical location of the bear, which is kind of interesting. So we won't spend a lot of time on identification of the bears, except as we started to talk about maybe how they're put together as far as the claws and stuff. A very small bear in Alaska versus a black bear back east. And we start talking about Idaho's black bears. It's kind of interesting. These were put together a few years ago. What color they really are, and that it's actually the browns or chocolates that are more common, and then we do have blonde black bears. Also, in other parts of the world, you can find, in this case, these are spirit bears of British Columbia. They're not albinos. That's just a color phase genetically that they can have. Although when I was in Japan, I did pick up this albino brown bear. It does have pink eyes. This is on the North Island of Hokkaido, so you can't. So our bears are Ursus americanus, found all over North America, as far as our black bears, and then Ursus arctos, which is a combination of Latin and Greek, both meaning bear. Ursus is, if you think about your constellations, Ursus major, Ursus minor, the big bear, little bear, that's in Latin, and then if you go to Greek, arctos is bear as well. So the brown bear or grizzly bear is actually scientifically bear. And I mentioned earlier about just where they're found. And the other thing that's important to note when we talk about brown bears is that when it comes to the IUC at global level. Okay, we always talk about Yellowstone bears being extinct in that, and actually those bears, if they were to disappear, that population would be called extirpated, not extinct. There's plenty of other brown bears on the planet. They're not in any danger of disappearing. So our brown bears are doing well, and the best bear species on the planet are the black bears. There's over probably 1 million. Harvest at least 2,000 black bears a year through legal methods of hunting. In the last 20 years, we went from having about 20,000 black bears in Idaho, we're up to over 30,000 black bears right now. So even though we're managing black bears, it's not hurting their population. And then one of the reasons for that is that black bears are one of those species, kind of like white-tailed deer and ravens and raccoons, that actually do okay around people. They actually, like right now where there's forest fires like Tahoe actually has had, before the fires hit, had more black bears today than it did in pre-settlement times, because the habitat had been modified to the point that there's actually more conducive bears, and that bears were actually living in the close environments of Tahoe because of the way people. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but it's for the thrill of hunting like any other animal. In Idaho, the black bear, the wolf, the mountain lion, you're not required to bring the meat in, but lots of people do enjoy eating bear meat. But it's just a combination of factors of why they do hunt it. But it is a management tool. And one thing you will note about Idaho is that we have far less problems with black bears than other places that don't hunt them or hunt them nearly as much. Again, because they're a species that seems to do so well around people that you do need to have some population management, and hunting is a big part of that. When it comes to trying to move bears around, I always use the phrase that they're big hairy boomerangs. They're always going to come back to where they came from, or they're going to get into the same trouble that they were in before. And so if you've got too many the management tool you're going to use. No shortage of brown bears on the planet, but they are in relation to Yellowstone ecosystem, other ecosystems. They're just keystone species that are easy to monitor. And it's better to have, but again, if they disappear from the lower 48, there's still going to be plenty of them on the planet, but maybe not just where we want them. When it comes to grizzly bears, the numbers are all over the place, which how many we probably had. One thing I'll get here in a sec, because we're in a museum that's kind of historical, is that we probably had at least 50,000 in the lower 48. And this map kind of shows the remnant populations over time. One thing that's really interesting, I think, is that California, the flag, of course, has the bear on it. When it became a state, there was probably 10,000 grizzly bears in California. And of course, today there's none. And so when you start to look at how fast you can get rid of something, the bears are a good example of a critter that it's easy to impact if you want. Now, one thing you'll notice on this map is that from 1920s, there was a population, at least for a bear, reported down here. And this is right. That fellow here, Robert Lindbergh, he was mega Idaho promoter, and he was super Craters of the Moon promoter. And he worked for, did stuff for UP as well. And he was a photographer and a taxidermist. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because here are some pictures that Bob took of grizzly bears. And these were some of the evidence that was used to document that there were grizzly bears in Craters of the Moon, which he was trying to get made into a monument. Well, if you notice the camera he's using, it's not a nice, SLR that you take a picture, snap, snap, snap. This is a glass plate camera. It took a bit for an image to expose. So yet he has grizzly bears standing, or sitting, but you never see their feet. Okay, so whether these were he would not have been beyond such a thing to kind of fabricate some evidence, but we'll take it for what it's worth. His evidence monument, but also to place grizzly bears out there in the middle of the Arctic desert. And so when we start thinking about bears, they can't live anywhere. And we'll talk about the adaptations they have. We always think about bears living in a situation like forest, but they are just as home here, like out of sagebrush desert. This is a sow with their yearlings, and they're actually eating ground squirrels here. Up like this, up at Kilgore, and then now up in Montana, where Lewis and Clark had their horrible time with the grizzlies. We're seeing grizzly bears out in the plains again, but what are now either wheat fields or corn fields, and there's no bison left. They're just cows and humans, and so a lot of conflicts arising up there as well. And this is just a reason to show you some of the conflicts in our neck of the woods, just based on recent numbers and where their recovery zones are at. So the bears, again, don't read maps, and so they're just going where bears used to be. And she was 20 years old, and she covered up to 8,000 kilometers in 3 years, wandering all over Montana and even into Idaho. And she crossed interstates along the way. There were no overpasses or anything. So bears can go where they want to go, if they want to go. They don't necessarily need our help, although it would probably be very beneficial for them to get around. So they can cover long distances. We don't know why Ethel did this. One thing about bears is that they, unlike wolves, they will share territory. I mentioned earlier, as long as there's food. So you will see overlap in bear territories, the home ranges. Just in this case, she just went on a walkabout. And they will walk about just anywhere. These are some black bears. And again, I mentioned how black bears are very adaptable to humans and in our situations. So we start looking at some of the things that make these animals the way they are. And this is from Dr. Steve. A bear, and if you start to look at the development, I'm not a brain surgeon type, but the thing that's really interesting to know is just some of the the life is their nose and the olfactory organs in their brain compared to what a human has. And I've got some pictures here of that in a second. The other part of the bear's brain that's well developed is its ability to reason. And that's what bears can get. They have a good memory as well. So, like I say, the bear brain isn't nearly as complex as a human, but it is a fairly well developed brain as far as the mammals go. Yeah, so. This is where their all the nerves from their nose hook into this huge olfactory organ there. In a human, you can barely see it. It's just a tiny little squibby things. The other part that's important, if I had a human skull here, the place where the nerves go from the nose to the human brain, it's like two little pinholes. If you go look at a grizzly, as far as what's their sense. When it comes to, I'll get to hear sense of smell in a sec, but and here's those organs again, they're just huge there as far as on a bear, not a person you can't even see. So we're starting to learn a lot about bears, and I'll talk about that as we go here. A lot of science being done as far as on the DNA of bears. We do a lot with radio collars. We're doing a lot of hair snares. And the thing about hair snares is it can give us all kinds of genetic information without actually having to grab onto the bear. And so that's helped out a great deal. But when it comes to finding out things, the bear collar is still the way to do it as far as because when we trap that bear, we would take its vitals, we would run electricity through it to see its fat content. And then thanks to the collar, we can track it down to within 3 feet or a meter, depending on how we want to collect the data. And that helps a lot. So it's built to house not just the brain, it's a good sized brain for animals, but also we'll talk a little bit here in a second about the nose and how to process all these smells. The other thing about bears that's interesting, and we'll get into it in a little bit later, is when they hibernate, how they process wastes. Because one thing that a bear does do in hibernation is it does not defecate, does not go to the bathroom, which is, as a human, if you think about going through the night and being successful is a big deal. These guys can do months without going to the bathroom, and they're able to recycle the waste products back into their system and keep themselves healthy and nourished, which is again something that's really incredible. The other thing about bears too is I mentioned a little bit about the reproduction as far as that delayed implantation and then being able to have offspring from multiple born, just kind of they come out and they actually crawl up to suckle the female. The other part that's wild is that while they're in the den, the bears will grow basically 20 times in size. And so if we start thinking about how big a bear is at birth, it's really kind of deceiving versus say a human. A human baby is 7 pounds at birth. The black bear is about 1/2 pound. A grizzly bear maybe 1 pound. So again, when we think of those then it could be up to 20 pounds. The thing that's interesting about the female is that if she goes into that den and her body is not in good shape, then those blastocysts will not implant, they'll just flush out. But likewise, a year or later, if she goes into the den with a young cub and her body's not in good shape, she'll cannibalize the cub because her body knows that she's probably going to die, the cub's going to die, but that if she eats the cub, she might have the energy she needs to then survive the winter and then reproduce again in the spring. So it's all about survival. It's not, there's not the emotional tie, it's just about getting through. I'm not going to spend a lot of muscular-wise, except I mentioned before, when you take that head off, you take those claws off, what's left behind is a fairly stout-looking carcass that often mistaken for a human. The other thing that's interesting about the way that bears hibernate and store their fat, and some people will say that bear meat is greasy, is because, again, they've got two different types of fat. One is a fat that is faster burning, another is a slower burning version, and they're able to absorb that and then reformulate it throughout their hibernation so that bears do not lose any muscle mass while they're hibernating. They can just get up after 2 months and walk away, which is pretty incredible. And that is one of the reasons that, along with the waste, that NASA is still studying bears, because of the fact that if we could do that on a mission to Mars, that people not go to the bathroom for months, or not need to eat for months, or not get bed sores, or lose muscle tone, that that helps to thing was I was seated at a restaurant in Paris next to a doctor from the army base in Germany, and he was a surgeon. And when he heard I did work with bears, he said, well, we learned from the bears with soldiers that are in medically induced comas to stop them from losing muscle tone. Because they used to put these guys that were blown up by IEDs, and they would put them into comas so they could heal up everything else, but then when they come out of those comas, they'd just be jello. So what they did is there was research done on how bears do these micro tremors in the muscles, and they were able to duplicate that using electricity in these soldiers. And so now when these soldiers are in these medically induced comas, they're doing these micro twitching in their muscles to keep their muscles in good shape. And they learned that from studying bears. So again, bears have all these cool adaptations that we can learn from. Another thing about bears that, as we get it a little bit later, look at as far as nerves go, they've got, distribution of nerves, but they're not the best distribution compared to, say, a person. And part of that reason is that bears and rocks and they really wouldn't have a very pleasant life. And that's one of the reasons why if you shoot a bear, you better hope you kill it, because it doesn't necessarily process pain the same way we do, because it doesn't necessarily have all this well-developed of a nerve network throughout its body, that it's actually able to, it just can't process it. But where it does have all its nerves are into the nose. And that's what's really key when we start talking about things like bear spray and self-defense against the bear, is how much of their nerves are tied into their nose. So again, their nerve network for their entire body is not necessarily robust, but to their nose, it's just overwhelming. When you look at a bear, its eyes are this is a continuum of mammals in relation to their brains. Bears' eyes are about just middle of the road, so a bear really doesn't have any better eyesight. I showed you was a bear standing up, and that posture isn't an attack posture, it's just a data gathering posture, because their eyes are not that great, their hearing's okay, but their nose, that's why that bear is standing up. So instead of being this high and smelling what's happening down here, we can get up here, we'll have definitely a better view and maybe hear a little better, but it's really gonna be able to smell what's happening. And when you start to read the literature on sense of smell, bears anywhere from 5 miles to 20 miles, depending on the population up in Alaska, where the interior doing their thing when a whale beached dead and rotted 100 miles on the coast, and those bears picked up that smell 100 miles out and went all the way down to the ocean and fed on that whale. So again, incredible sense of smell. And this is all really beneficial because of this word here. I'll talk about the whole phases of hibernation, but part of pre-hibernation is a thing called basically just, it's Latin for pig out, brain damage, where they just can't stop eating. Well, bears are doing it because that's what they're programmed to do. They're programmed to put on as much weight as possible before they go into hibernation, because again, if it's a female, that's going to determine whether her young develops or not. And if for a male, it's also have impact on how he's going to do in the winter. One thing that's, when we start talking about hibernation, is that black bears tend to need to hibernate in rocks and in logs and places, dens dug in the ground. Grizzlies will do that, but they don't have to. Grizzlies are so well insulated that a grizzly bear can just lay down and let snow cover it up and it'll be fine, which is a pretty, like I say, neat adaptation. You don't need to waste a lot of energy digging holes if you can just lay there and let yourself be covered up by snow. And so one thing that we're seeing is that because of climate change, we are seeing bears being out and about more. Because the thing about bears is they don't need to hibernate. Hibernation is not a requirement. Prime examples of that. In their world, there's no tourists in the winter, and so tourists would make that business work and also buy the food. So they just let the bears hibernate. They just let the photo period and the cold do its work. Those bears then up at Grizzly Wolf Discovery Center, if you're been to West Yellowstone in the winter, there's a lot of tourists in West Yellowstone. So rather than let their bears hibernate, they just feed the bears all winter. They don't play a lot of music, they don't poke them, they don't give them drugs, coffee, they just feed them. And that allows the bear not to have to enter into hibernation. And that's the same reason why if we look at, say, a black bear in Alabama, it won't have to hibernate all winter. So it just does nothing but eat all year round. And that's why those black bears that live in warmer climates with good food sources are twice the size, if not 3 times the size of our bears, because it's just then they kick into hibernation. But other bear species that are in warmer climates traditionally don't. And so again, I'm not going to say that they're hibernators and that they don't hunt squirrels. When you pull out a marmot, you literally have to thaw it out. Where bears just go down a bit, their breathing slows down, their heartbeat slows down, but they definitely can kick it back into gear if they need to. And so this just, again, some numbers here. One thing about black bears is they do go down lower than a grizzly bear. That's why if you ever watch Animal Planet, there's always a guy crawling around in a bear's den. It's going to be a black bear's den. It's not going to be a grizzly bear den. Grizzly bears are a little different in that they don't go down as far and they're always alert. We did some research putting pacemakers in bears and then monitoring human activity around the bears to see how soon the bear could react to a human. And we found out that even a few hundred yards out, a human just in the woods, the bear is aware of that. In the winter, there's explosive video of bears. The dogs come in and the grizzlies just to other animals. And the thing that's interesting is that they of course have hibernation like we know it as far as where they're down. Awake, they're not really eating a lot yet, but they're kind of wandering around, and finally they start to get to that where it's normal, and that's where summer is, and then they get to the fall where they get into that hyperphagia stage. So it's kind of interesting way that their bodies are controlled, and even when they're awake, then they're not quite all there for that month or so in the spring. The other thing about bears is we classify them, especially around here, as carnivores, and that's out of fear. It's not out of science as much, because they do have of course, the meating incisors and canines. They also have the molars for grinding. So they're actually omnivores. Now we do have, of course, polar bears, which tend to be definitely in the carnivore side of things. One thing we did find through some eating just canned meat now. So they're like your vegan friend that, or vegetarian friend that can't help but walk by that bacon, grab a piece. So pandas, again, mostly they're herbivores, but they have been known to document and snack on meat. But again, they are carnivores. And around here, what's interesting is that one of the foods from the vegetation, and unlike a pure carnivore. So, you know, we're omnivores, but when we eat our salads, it's mainly because we're trying to lose weight, because we're not getting a lot out of it. Bears actually are processing and getting something out of it. And when it comes to what they'll eat, they are incredible omnivores. And this is just some research that we did in Yellowstone, and found out that bears will eat anything. And bears are like people, and that people have certain tastes. Some people like fish, some people like chicken, some people are vegetarian. Bears are the same way. And we know that thanks to those radio collars down to 1 meter, because we have people out there tracking where those bears had been a week or two before and see what they'd eaten, whether they'd torn up stumps to eat insects, whether they'd eaten mushrooms, dead cow, dead calf, you name it. And some of the stuff they ate was pretty incredible. This grandma there, never been longer. Well, in Yellowstone, they have documentation of grizzlies being big, basically pool skimmers, and just slurping up just thousands upon thousands of just floating insects there. So pretty, like I say, total, I mean, all-purpose kind of animal, and that's one of the reasons why, not to get into politics, but the delisting of grizzly bears in Yellowstone is not based on diet. Okay, even though some of their food sources are in trouble, we've seen that their reproduction is remaining high as far as twins and triplets and quads, which a starving bear would do, and that they can't eat just about anything, and that you'll hear about the importance of white bark pine nuts. Some bears love them, some bears walk right by them, they don't like them. So again, the bears aren't starving to death in Yellowstone. And for Yellowstone, 4 major food sources, one of the most important which is this little guy right here, which is army cutworm moth. And that is the highest Asia right now, and they're flipping over these rocks where these army cutworm moths have come to mate. And these bears are gaining 20 pounds a day by eating moths. So if you think about what a moth weighs, to gain 20 pounds, that's a lot of moths. That's hefty bags of moths. And so these bears just flip these rocks over all day long and scoop up armfuls of these moths and put on 20 pounds. The problem is bears also eat all kinds of other stuff. And in this case, this was up by Chester, where we have Sow and her 2 yearlings that had learned, they'd been moved over to the Jedediah Smith Wilderness over Wyoming. They were apple bears. And so they learned, and they were caught eating apples in these people's trees over by Chester. And so Mom, at this point, Mom was in bad shape. She was actually put down on site. The 2 cubs were released back into I think they should go to the Facebook page for Ashton. Fishing Game is up there working with the master naturalists and people up there to collect all the downed apples. Because there's all kinds of little homes just chow down on the apples. The problem is they not only eat the ground fall, but they definitely climb into trees as well. So as long as there's apples there, bears will be there. The less that are available, the better. So that's why this is last year, just collecting all the apples so we can track bears. So once bears learn something, that brain stores it away and they always go looking for it. So, when it comes to bears and people, I always like to bring this up that so far in Idaho, we've never had a person killed by a black or grizzly bear. All of our neighboring states can't say that. We definitely have attacks every year, but again, none of them have been fatal. And even for those that are fatal, well, the rate is only about 1 every other year in the Intermountain West, or 1 a year at most in the whole West. So again, bears are not huge killers of humans, and even like I say, aside from Timothy Treadwell, they do kill human. So that's why we work to do so much work with these garbage containers to try to keep bears out. Because again, they have incredible bite strength when it comes to their jaws. And one thing that when we talk about people identifying bears, we talk about a grizzly bear having a round head versus a black bear having a more narrow head like a dog. The reason for that is simple. If you look at this grizzly skull here, this part here called the occipital ridge is where all the jaw muscles join into. So he's got all these muscles that hook up here, go to the jaws, and create an incredible strength, makes his head round. This skull here is not, I know it's a black bear skull, not by its size, because I could have gone to Florida and got a huge black bear skull. But what's different is that ridge upon layers like a grizzly bear. So that's why his head is going to be narrow, and he has the weaker jaw strength. So that's why we say when you look at a bear, it looks, forget about the color, got a round head like a teddy bear, that's a brown bear. It's got a narrow head like a dog, then it's going to be a black bear. And this is what their teeth should look like. And one thing here I mentioned earlier about the nose, these are the turbinates in the nose, so incredibly developed, well developed compared to what we have in our nostrils. But again, this is what their teeth should look like. And this is what the damage they can do. This bear was alive. He was caught in a snare, which is just a cable. He thought the cable was tied to this tree, so this occurred overnight. He chewed through this tree just to get away. The problem was that the cable went around that tree to another drag tree, so he didn't get away before we get there and dart him. But it shows you what their teeth can do as far as if they want to. In Island Park area over the years, they were getting into trouble because they outlived their teeth. And you can start to see that. Once teeth are gone, then they have other bears are breaking into cabins to get refrigerators and ice chests. So again, once the teeth are gone, then they resort to other things that they've stored away in their brains. But this is another example of why bears are, could be delisted in Yellowstone, is that we've got bears outliving their teeth, which is a ripe old age into the mid and late 20s. And I mentioned a little bit about their noses, and the best example of that is, here's just we say those turbinates, and say when we start talking about smell, we're talking about 21, at least 2,000 times better than human. So pretty very well developed sense of smell, and that's again what gets them into food, but also gets them into trouble. And I always liken this, if anybody has one of those old Bose wave radios, that's kind of how those nasal passages work. We're able to process all of it. Towards the end here, just a little bit about our bears and how we manage them and what we do with them. This is just, again, some sentiment we're having here, which is fine, but we also have, again, we talked about hunting. One thing about Idaho is that we're one of the few states that still allows use of dogs. The dogs don't kill the bear, they treat the bear. The problem is dogs can't generally tell the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear. And then when a dog chases a grizzly bear, it chases back or it kills them. And it goes right back to the person, the dog handler, which is not a good thing. And the other problem is we've hunted over bait in Idaho for decades, which is basically a garbage can full of donuts. The problem we have is that not only are we habituating black bears to this, we're also habituating brown bears to this. And so now this bear is hooked on human foods. And so that's a political, social thing that we need to work at here in Idaho, because again, we have places around here where we still allow garbage or bait to be used where grizzly bears have expanded into, so they're getting, we're getting grizzlies hooked on it. The other thing that's a little interesting is that Idaho is still one of the few states that allows the sale of bear parts. Okay, and this is a bear gallbladder, and not that our bears in this situation, but over in Asia, Vietnam, there's quite a trade in gallbladders, and there's actually farms that, if you go to them, they're going to have tubes coming out of the bears. They surgically open up the bears, hook a drain tube into the gallbladder, and then drain out the bile. The thing that's interesting about it is that from a standpoint of medicinal use, it was used to treat arthritis, and they synthesized it, and it does work, but you don't need to use bear bile anymore. The other use, of course, it was for things like aphrodisiacs. To do that, so selling organs can get out of hand, and there's probably not a reason that we need to do that here in Idaho as well, anymore, I would think. But what we're really doing more than anything is we're loving them to death. And this is an example in Yellowstone now where there's 399 you mentioned earlier. I mean, there's bears there that have more Facebook friends than all of us put together here. And people go looking for them. They're not just looking for a bear, they're looking for certain bears. And we get to the point where the bear jams are being created. And part of the reason the females are here by the road with their cubs, so because there's too many bears in Yellowstone right now, and the males are killing the females, but the males won't come close to the roads. So the females will learn that if they hang out by the roads, they can avoid the males, and maybe the cubs last longer. But it's starting to be a real issue because these bears do become eventually desensitized to humans, even though we try not, people try not to feed them, but some people may be doing that. And again, there's all kinds of chat going on social media about where bears are and what, and again, a lot of people just back and forth. And it gets to the point that we had a bear named Felicia that was going to be moved and get in trouble because people were trying to track her down. Stuff. So this relationship with, so again, something we need to think about here when we start dealing with wildlife. So I think I'm going to just zip ahead to the very end here because that was some of my stuff that I had time to talk about. Just to mention that when it comes to culture or safety, bear spray really is the tool we use. Okay, guns are a great tool when you hunt, but when it comes to self-defense situation, bear spray does work far better than a gun. And I don't know if anybody saw it today, a lady used her bear spray against the wolves that were chasing her dogs. I see over there. So and, it does really work. And this is an example of a training tool we had where there's a rubber band bear that would shoot at, come out, you could shoot at the spray. Educational tool. We also had a Nerf gun there. You can try to shoot that and see how well you can do with a kill shot on a bear. And again, even at a third of the speed, it's not that easy. That's why bear spray is definitely the tool to use. Again, because of that nose, because of the way it lights that bear with the pain that it's never felt before, and yet it doesn't injure the bear. Unlike some flip, and so again, there's lots of different varieties out there. You can buy it at Sam's Club, Costco now. The thing that's interesting is that bear spray at most has 3% capsaicin, red pepper in it. The stuff sense of smell the bears on, where with the bear, it's just a waste of money, and it's all about money here. So they don't load these up with 10 or 20% pepper. Some people around here were using the problem with this is that it's a chemical and it doesn't just irritate and cause pain, it causes permanent damage and blindness. So again, rather than have it wear off in a half hour, 45 minutes, you get a bear that's now blinded for life, it's definitely going to be trouble. So again, if you know anybody that's using that, tell them not to, even though this costs $5 versus $40. It's still the wrong thing to use. And it definitely will injure the bear and may not work even. So bear spray does work. And the other thing is, again, we keep the bears out of trouble. There's food orders now all around here as far as storing your food in bear proof containers as far as campgrounds or even at picnic areas. And here's, I mentioned again, we're at Sam's Club or Walmart, just being able to buy these coolers that have been tested by those bears up there in the Grizzly Discovery Center. And these would need to have a better lock on it. This rubber thing won't work, but there's a place to put a lock on there. As long as you use the right lock. They're part of our culture, our Native American culture, but even other parts of the world are big. And there's still work going on with bears over in Romania. They dancing bear. Even in India, they had dancing. Over in Japan is there is still a native tribe of people that worship the bear. And one very interesting thing about their religion is that even PETA has some break on this, is that they will go out and get a cub and they will raise the cub. Women will actually nurse the cub. But then when it gets to be like a year old, the whole village gets around the bear and they kill it. They all take turns whacking it and sticking it and knife, whatever, and then they all eat the bear because that's part of that circle of life for them. And so again, it's interesting the way worldwide bears and people have this really strong connection. And part of this is the way they're put together and how they relate. And we don't teach them bad things around here. This is a great book written by a fellow who writes for the Missoulian, and it's a good overview of what's going on with grizzly bears around here. And this fellow, I will give him a plug. Most media people don't spend time on the topic. This guy sat through days of horribly boring meetings with the Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee and other management folks. So again, he does write from a position of knowledge. If you want to learn about just bear attacks, this needs to be a new edition. And all the bear attacks and why they don't. Other times they definitely weren't. It's just the bear doing what a bear does to protect its food or protect its young. So with that, this is a little cartoon a friend drew for me. I think it just kind of says it all. It's bears just being bears. It's what we do that makes the difference. And hopefully today I've shown you a few different things about what makes bears function the way they do, and hopefully understand a little bit about how we relate to them.
/brown bears, you didn't ever use the word subspecies, did you? Is there a reason for that?
Because they're not.
It's not?
No, versus Arctos.
That's the first, well, I gathered that you didn't think so.
No, if you talk about, say, Kodiaks,
Yeah,
Kodiak is a subspecies.
yeah, I thought they both were.
No, it's all a place name kind of thing, whether it's a brown bear or a grizzly bear or Ursus arctos horribilis. Again, it's Ursus arctos. It's not, again, a lot of the subspecies names we gave were and where we were at, but thanks to DNA, like I say, we can see that certain these bears are all the same bear at heart, you know, so that again, the bear that we have here in Idaho is genetically the same as that bear in Japan or the bear in Italy. They're all Ursus arctos.
Because people have, because I said, you know, I thought, well, it's just that it's smaller.
It's all
But
function
it's
of,
other stuff too.
it's a function of habitat and diet is what, and then is what those differences that you're seeing in the animal, but it's the same. Whereas the black North American bear, those other black species, the spectacled bear and the Andean, you know, those bears are all different species. They're not even subspecies, but they're separate species of black bears. So.
And when you're talking about the hybrid polar brown,
Yeah.
are the offspring
They're fertile.
fertile or not?
They are.
They are fertile.
Yep. And brown bears and black bears can can interbreed as well. There used to be a circus around here called Reed's Brothers Circus. It used to come around, and they had mutt bears in there as well that were just kind of captive bred. And one thing I will mention about, say, about Bear World is that none of the animals there are wild animals. All the animals in there, with the exception of maybe turkeys that fly in, are domestic livestock. It's like a farmer taking care of his livestock. They're not wild animals. The result of captive breeding that occurred over generations from a time when people could go out and get what the mountain goats there are not wild animals. They're from breeding from folks that were able to legally take those animals a century ago. But there have been, like I say, if you follow Joe Exotic bears, even with Joe Exotic.
Kill the cubs around here? Like, do the workers, are they aware? Is it kind of
It's
hidden?
not common knowledge, no, but if you ever think about it, every year there's a crop of bears that are cute and cuddly.
Mhm.
And then the next year there's another crop of cute cuddly bears, but there's not more bears in Bear World.
Right.
And I can say from having worked at Fish and Game, we were never informed that bears were leaving, because again, that would require certain documentation. But some things that come to light are coming to light as I speak that show some violations that definitely did occur, or some transport that was not notified to Fish and Game. There's a lot of politics involved in this one, and a lot of the media has refused to touch it just because of all the money that comes out of Bear World for PR. That's how the world works. But more and more people are finding out about it. A bear that did die just this summer named Brutus was owned by KSAs and things that were Bear World, and they were going to kill the bear and throw it in the burn pit. And he said, if you do that, I'll go to the public with it. So he took that cub and raised it on his own. So, and that's where Bruce the bear who just died came from. So, yeah, it's very, like I say, it's interesting because again, they're not wild animals. They're again, once upon a time, their ancestors were, but they are now under the category of domestic livestock and are not under the purview of Idaho Fish and Game. Good question.
How does the bear meat compare nutritionally to cattle or other kinds of meat?
I don't know from a nutrition standpoint. And like I say, I do know that it has a higher fat content, so than say like a moose or something that's a really lean meat. So, but I couldn't say how it stacks up to cattle, except again, part of the difference is put it and not just in huge lumps like on or strands like on a cow. But again, for folks that it's fine meat to eat. It's like any predator can have trichinosis, so you need to be sure to cook it properly. And it can carry other diseases like chronic wasting disease. It could get brucellosis. I mean, all those things that you see in other animals it can have as well. So it's important to take care of it properly.
I was a kid, I almost always had bear meat to eat when we went to visit.
And again, part of it has to do with what they eat too. You know, some bears are going to be big grazers, so it's just like, you know, it's like maybe more of a finish to it than, you know, other things. So good questions. And normally when I do my teacher workshop in the summer for Harriman about wild bears, one of the things that we always do is make sure that the teachers got a chance to eat some bear. Just they can say they've eaten it and tried it out. All right, well, like I say, feel free to take a look at anything up there if you want. That's just a small, most of that stuff Fish and Game did allow me to use. They loaned it to me. But But again, the thing is a little bit, but at the same time, make sure that we're not doing things that are going to get them in trouble that could in turn get us in trouble. All right, thank you.